Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to Watch Your Six. I'm your host, Jason Edwards. We're delighted you joined us. We're going to talk about multiple topics today with what's going on in the world, the global instabilities, economic challenges. We're also going to look into, in this podcast, a little bit of ways that you can mitigate your tax liability, maybe take advantage of some of the resources if you own your own organization or company to help maybe fund some of your vacations and other trips because frankly, you've earned it. You've worked very hard. So we wanted to start off with what we consider a challenge when you're investing. Nobody likes to lose money. That's the problem. So with investing, we've talked in the past shows, our emotions typically are the dynamic that impact us the most because when there's a little level of trepidation or fear, what happens is we have a tendency to say, oh my God, I'm not going to invest, I'm going to sell, or I've lost money in the past. So all of those challenges war against what we consider the norms. And the norms, as we've highlighted in previous podcasts, is that the market does fairly well. It's fairly robust. It's very resilient. Even though we've had market corrections over the years, we've always come back up. That being said, we want to maybe give you some things that you can do with your investment portfolios that can help mitigate risk, but more importantly, help you maybe with your anxieties or stressors. So one of the things we're going to talk about today is what we call defensive positions. Now, as you can imagine, a defensive position is exactly what it says and how it's described. It's designed to defend against a market correction. It's designed to help mitigate some of the market volatility. You'll hear terms in our industry called standard deviation, beta, alpha. These are all just deviations, or these are all just terminologies rather, to help you indicate how a portfolio is going to mimic an index. So for example, if you have a portfolio that has a low beta, that's just a fancy word for that portfolio is going to underperform as it relates to the stock market. It's probably going to be very, very conservative. There's not going to be a lot of growth. Likewise, if the portfolio was high beta, above a number one, then there's a good possibility that's going to react more aggressively compared to the market. So when you're looking at your investment portfolios, and if maybe you have an investment advisory team, you can ask them, hey, what's my beta in my portfolio? Or what's my standard deviation? That's another great term. And standard deviation, again, is just a fancy phrase to say, how much does my investment go up or down? Now, if you're a person who has a risk aversion, if you just traditionally don't like risk and you're willing to give up growth, then you're going to want us to have a deviation that's going to be very low, right? You're not going to want a portfolio that swings 30 points each way. You're going to want to have a beta that might be lower than 1 because that's the benchmark. But those are things that you look at when it comes to the portfolio after it's designed. What we're going to talk about today is before it's designed, or the things that we can put into your portfolio that help you mitigate that. Now, we're a big advocate of diversification. You hear that term used over and over and over, but the reality is all that means is if you have more than one plate, those plates allow you to basically offset each other. So as one plate or boat drops, the other one rises. So the more diversified you are, logically, the better chance you're going to have to protect yourself. Now, when you diversify, it doesn't simply say, you know what, I'm going to have a bunch of mutual funds or a bunch of stocks. That's the mistake a lot of people make. No, those mutual funds or those stocks have to be in different sectors. They have to be in different categories because that allows you to mitigate some of the risk. Now, one of the best areas to mitigate some of the risk is what you call defensive positions. These are investments that traditionally track very well regardless of what's going on in the economy. And they're really about 4 sectors or 5 sectors that you want to look at. One is consumer staples, one is healthcare, one is utilities, and one is, as we know, telecommunications. Now, why are those 5 sectors so critical? What makes them defensive? Well, let's take consumer staples first. Now, consumer staples, as we talked about and the name sort of represents, are consumer products that regardless of what's going on in the world, you need. So when the economy gets, necessarily performs poorly, or there's a market correction, or there's some kind of recessionary issue, people still need groceries. They may not buy as many, but they still need groceries. Tobacco is another one. You'll see things like household goods. So again, regardless of what's going on in the economic environment, people still need to clean their clothes. They need soap. They need toiletries. So you can understand why those would be considered defensive positions. Now, keep in mind the spread on those positions aren't necessarily massive or incredible. So they don't necessarily have a incredible growth potential. So that's why you would call it a conservative or a defensive position, because while it keeps growing slowly, and it does well, it doesn't knock the ball out of the park. So consumer staples are a great way to look at it, and if you have questions on who you might want to invest in, just look in your medicine cabinet. Look in your pantry. Who do you buy? What do you purchase? Those are the companies that are making money in that defensive environment. Then maybe you look to invest in those same entities, but that's a good barometer. Another one is utilities. Now, if you think about utilities, that's a broad spectrum. So that's your water, your light, your gas, etc. But again, regardless of economic environment, people will fight very hard to keep the lights on. So that is very much a defensive position. The other thing about utilities is those particular services are considered mission critical. So since they're mission critical, they get subsidies in some cases, right? You've got utility companies or entities that sometimes get funding from the government. So the likelihood of default, the likelihood of those entities going out of business is very low. So do you think that's a good investment opportunity? Do you think that's possibly a good conservative position? I would. And that's a resource that many people don't look into. Utility companies also have a couple of different components. So remember, when you're talking about a conservative investment, or more specifically a defensive, you're looking at three areas of that particular entity and why it's there and why it's considered conservative. And we highlighted a little bit about some of the two positions, but stable earnings, low volatility, and dividends. Well, let's think about utilities. Are there stable earnings? Yeah, it's pretty stable. People need their water, they need their power. Low volatility, absolutely. Most utility companies have very little competition. They're in an area, and that's the utility that you use. And then dividends, yes, a lot of utility companies or consumer product companies generate dividends. They're long the position. They've been in the industry for years. They own that market share. So if you think about many of the large groceries or the large consumer products, they've been around 50, 60, 70 years. So they're good dividend yields. So those are two sectors. Now, the third sector is, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, a sector that's fairly stable is healthcare. As we have our populations aging, what's happening? Well, as they age, their need for healthcare becomes greater. So the reality is you've got a sector that basically has an unlimited amount of resources coming into it. So you've got medical manufacturing, you've got hospitals, you've got pharmaceutical, biologics, the list goes on and on. So that's another great area. You have to be a little careful though when you start playing with the difference between, let's say, a provider like a hospital versus a big pharma company with an exploratory drug, or experimental drug rather. That possibility could be that that drug doesn't sell or doesn't get to the market or doesn't get cleared. So again, healthcare, you want to drill down, you want to make sure you're looking at it effectively, but that is an industry, regardless of economic conditions, people, some of the poorest nations, unfortunately, you'll see they still have hospitals, they still have doctors. Another one is telecommunication. Now, that in itself is a big word. So telecommunication in general could be AI, it could be cell phones. So we wouldn't say that would be what you call a defensive position, but telecommunication as a sector is mission critical. The ability to communicate, internet, cell phone service, they're not going anywhere. So when you're investing in that sector, you're investing in a sector that can somewhat be insulated. Now again, this is where you have to do your due diligence, and you have to make sure your advisory team sat down with you and discussed it. Because if you're investing, for example, a wireless network, or you're investing in a company that you feel comfortable about, well, we've seen a litany of organizations over time go out of business. And that goes for any of those sectors. You know, Enron was a big company, went out of business. So any of these sectors can have one or two entities that can be somewhat impacted. But overall, if you're talking about one industry or another industry that, regardless of the economy, still goes on, that would be telecommunications. Think about how critical and mission critical, and even if it isn't mission critical, just think about the relevance of what a cell phone has today with someone. You have people that have no money, and they'll spend their last dime to get their cell phone upgraded because there's a value that they feel is appropriate for that. So if I were to invest in a sector, that would be one of the other sectors. And again, remember what you're looking for. So we go back through these 5 sectors. and we look at these industries, make sure the companies you're looking at have those three-pronged approach I touched about, right? Stable earnings, we've talked about low volatility, and we talked about consistent dividends. So if I'm looking at consumer staples, I'm looking at utilities, I'm looking at healthcare, I'm looking at telecommunications, I want to look at those companies in there, or those funds, and see, now, do those companies I'm looking at, do they have sustained earnings? Do they have low volatility? And how do I monitor that? Well, look at their share prices. How much wiggle did you see up or down when you had the recent corrections, the last correction? What did it do? And then dividends. Are they generating dividends? Now, I'm always a little concerned about the dividend side, and you want to be careful of that because you could be generating tax liability that you don't need. So when you look at a conservative position, or you look at something for a defensive position, you also want to make sure, if I do this, how much am I putting into that area? Because the dividend yield, which is the amount of money that is coming out of that position, could generate a tax liability. And I already don't need the money. This is just an investment. So you might want to shy away from some of those positions that have a high dividend yield, because those positions could impact your tax bill, your bottom line. You get a 1099 at the end of the year, and now you're paying taxes for 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50,000, whatever you received, and you didn't even need the income. You just invested because you wanted to be somewhat conservative. So those are some of the trade-offs you have to be concerned about. When you meet with your advisory team, whoever they are, that's the things that you want to look at, and that's the stuff we talk about with Watch Your Six. So here we are saying, hey, I want to invest in a defensive position. I'm worried about the market. I'm worried about the volatility in the market. But lo and behold, nobody really told me about the fact that I got these really good investments, but they pay a lot in dividends. So now at the end of the year, what happens is I've got a huge tax bill for money I didn't need. That's another thing that you have to be careful of. So again, in summation, there are opportunities, and the defensive positionings are very good. I traditionally, depending on the age of the client, don't recommend a huge footprint in that environment because, again, as I mentioned earlier, the growth potential is somewhat abated. It's not that great. You don't have a lot of explosion. There's no emerging cereal that just came out and everybody can't wait to buy that one cereal. So those kind of goods or those kind of resources are not the place you'll make a huge profit. But what you will do is take some of the volatility and some of the exposure out of your portfolio. And that allows you to sort of sleep at night, not be as concerned. Your percentages, again, you use the concept we talked about, the rule of 100. We use that in one of our previous podcasts. Look at your age, and based on your age, subtract that from 100. That's your ratio. So if I'm 70 and I take it out of 100, then about 70% of my portfolio honestly should be mostly fixed positions, and I should only have about a 30% position in equity. Now that doesn't work for everybody. That's just a good barometer to start with, and hopefully if you talk to your financial planning team, they'll start using some of the tools that we share with you to mitigate your risk and maximize your growth. Remember, if you don't take advantage of these opportunities, they don't come around again. You don't have the chance to look back. So take advantage, do your due diligence, make sure you have your team on the same page, and then implement, and then let that implementation unfold. And I think you'll be very, very happy. We talked about that in the past. Now, one of the other things that we have discussed is those entrepreneurs, those executives that own their own companies, and this is specifically for companies that have a singular leader. When you have multiple leaders, it's a little different dynamic. If you have a full board of directors, that can be challenging. But if you have an LLC, an S Corp, or C Corp, there are some incredible resources out there that are in our tax code. And unfortunately, your CPAs do a very poor job in some cases of relaying that information, and that's not their fault. It's that they're inundated with filings. When tax season comes around, they don't have time to sit down and spend 3 or 4 hours looking at your assets, looking at your corporate structure. They're literally getting raw data fed at almost like a fire hose, and they're having to put out returns. So it's not really their fault. That's where your planning team comes in, and they should be looking at how you're set up and how you're structured. I'll give you a great example. If you have an LLC S Corp, think about opening an advisory board. Now, why do I say that? Well, the advisory board can be your family. They can help advise. You can have your wife on there, your kids. Those individuals can be on the advisory board, and they can provide insight if they're involved in the business. That's fair. Well, if they're doing that, they can get paid. So now that payment goes to the family members as opposed to strangers, and now you've got compensation coming in, and that's a write-off to the company. One step further, when you do these advisory board meetings, you can do those anywhere. So if you, for example, decide to go on a vacation and say, you know what, I want to have an advisory board meeting while I'm here, take your notes, keep all that information available so it's there for the IRS if you needed it, but that entire thing could be written off. See, so there's all kinds of loopholes. There's another great loophole, well, not loophole, I hate to use that term, but resources, really, legal resources that people just don't take advantage of. Another great resource is what they call a solo 401k. We've talked about that in the past. If you're a singular owner of a company, or you own it with your spouse, you can create a solo 401k. So this is a 401k for self-employed people, but here's the catch. With most 401ks, you're only talking about 25 to 30 grand you can put away as tax deduction. Solo 401k contributions vary based on your age, but in some cases you can put up to $60,000, $70,000 away each year, tax deductible if you do it properly. Imagine socking away $60,000 to $70,000 a year, and your net income is less than 100 grand that you report because you're keeping most of it. So there are incredible tools out there. The biggest mistake we see with clients is especially ones that run their own companies, is they spend so much time working in their company, they're never working on their company. So as I've said before, they're the marketer, they're the phone answerer, they're the administrator, they're the plumber, and now their company flounders because those resources are not being properly isolated or dedicated. So take the time. I know it's exhausting, especially if you're an owned entity or you're a busy person dealing with today's world. Take the time to sit down with your advisory team. Contact them, or feel free to DM us. Email us, DM us some of your questions, and we'd be happy to discuss those with you. But get that information because you really would be kicking yourself. And you want to make sure that you're not leaving money on the table that's yours. How hard do you work for the money today? How much does that money get you? Well, why would you waste any opportunity to have those resources? So again, hopefully that information sort of gives you some insight and you feel a little bit better about what we discussed. But those are some of the tools that we consistently see being missed. So in today's podcast, remember, we talked about defensive positions, how to add those defensive positions to your existing investment portfolio. Remember, those areas were telecommunications, healthcare, consumer staples, right? We talked about that. And those other resources. And then we talked about some of the components that you want to make sure are in those investments: low volatility, stable earnings, and high dividends. If you do that, you follow that model, you're going to be fairly surprised on how you can mitigate some of that risk. And then for those entrepreneurs and those self-employed people out there, take advantage of the legal tax resources that are available in the tax code. If you've got, I gave you one example of opening an advisory board. It's not that challenging, but you can actually have your family members. You're working with your wife, you're working with your family, put them on the board. Let them give you some insight and then pay them for it. It's a great deduction. You can write that off. Location, write that off. Or maybe a solo 401k. And again, this is just a snapshot of some of the resources that most people just aren't aware of. So we hope that that helps guide you a little bit, give you some insight. It shows you the potential. We're not proposing you get very aggressive. We're just saying tweak some of the tools that you're utilizing and you'll see your earnings go higher. Why do I say that? Well, if I reduce your taxes by 10% every dollar, that's 10% more you keep, right? So if you do proper tax planning, you have the potential of having incredible growth. If I mitigate some of the volatility in your portfolio, so then you don't get exhausted by trying to maybe mitigate and then sell when you shouldn't sell, well, now the potential of stable earnings is higher. So these are all little nuances, little adjustments that can help you. But we always recommend talk to your financial planning team. If you don't have one, feel free to contact our office. We'd be happy to help you. We're with people all over the country. But get the information before you start spending the money. Welcome back to Watch Your Six. This is Jason's Quick Five. We've got 5 topics that are being shoot from our audiences and our let me start over again.
Yeah, start over. Touch the screen real quick before you start over. Touch the phone screen.
Yeah,
so it doesn't,
So hey, welcome back. This is Jason's Quick Five. Just a new little thing we're going to start at the end of the podcast. We've got 5 basic buzz questions coming from Grady and you, the audience, and we'll try to answer those in a way that you get some information. So Grady, what do we have?
Jason, number one, the government shutdown. How is that going to affect my portfolio?
So that's two ends of the spectrums there. You've got individuals that are more concerned with right now their actual benefits. Unfortunately, that's true. You've got people like SNAP benefits and those that rely on food and the ability to feed their family. You also have an entire industry that is not going to have the money it needs to pay its bills. So there could be a ripple effect. What do I mean? Well, TSA. You've got TSA workers, for example, haven't paid in 30 days. You've got individuals that are being impacted and they have to pay their bills, right? So that money trickles into the economy. So short term, I don't think it'll be a big deal. If this goes on for 3 or 4 more months, there could have a huge impact on the consumer spending areas. And those are things you have to be careful with. The Senate failed to pass its bill. I really feel that it's more of an ego thing than a logical thing because obviously there's financial impact there. The government has a propensity to add money where it doesn't need to add money and spend money. So that could be one of the challenges. We try to stay sort of middle of the road.
Jason, number 2, Tylenol. What the heck is going on over there? It looks like Kleenex is trying to acquire them.
Yeah, so there's a company called Kenvue Inc. And whenever there's any environment, merger and acquisitions actually been fairly slow these last 2 years. So it's interesting to see these M&Es start to come up. They're looking at about $48 billion. So there could be the potential there for some growth. If you're looking to invest, I would still do my due diligence. I would look into those companies a little bit further and look in Kenvue and see what your thought process on there. But that could be a really good play.
Number 3, we cannot stop talking about NVIDIA. Tell me a little bit.
Yeah, so NVIDIA, we've been a huge advocate of years ago, even before the recent correction. But you're looking at $5 trillion in market cap. That's outrageous. In most cases, you might say, well, that's fairly overinflated. But with the way that AI is expanding so quickly and the amount of expansion of both power supply resources and technology, I think companies like these are well positioned as long as they keep up. That's the reality. There are a lot of companies in the field, graveyards I call them, the old tech bubble back in the 1990s that just didn't keep up, and today they're left behind. But that is really a big play right now. Again, $5 trillion in market cap is massive.
Number 4, U.S. national debt hits $38 trillion.
I can't really get into that too much because we have a problem when it comes to our expense, which is why we have a shutdown. People don't realize why we have a shutdown. We have a legal cap that the government's supposed to, like you and I do, a budget every year that they're supposed to stay under. And what happens is they just don't care. They eventually spend above that. Now they've got to raise the cap. So when you're looking at, $1 trillion added in 2 months, that's a lot of money. I would say that the debt is a big issue for us, and that's something we really have to correct because it's like you making money but having multiple credit cards. If you keep just paying the interest on those credit cards, you're never going to get out of a hole. So those are one of the dynamics I think is a big concern. Hopefully we get those things corrected. The cuts that we saw recently, those helped a little bit, but not $1 trillion. So.
Number 5, gold price, biggest drop in over a decade?
So that's an interesting one because people always get very, very excited about gold because they figure it's a good conservative position. I personally don't really like gold. It's not what it was 20 years ago. And this is a great example. Things like jewelry, price point dropped over 20+%. So here you are buying all this gold and wanting to build this wealth. And now you go back to the jeweler to try to sell it and it's down 25%. I mean, that's insane. Gold is a very volatile position. Even though it's a finite commodity, the propensity for gold being used and the fluctuations are very dramatic. So I like gold for a small position, depending on the person, but like any other investment, it has its risks. So those are great questions.
I got a bonus one for you. Netflix,
Okay.
10-to-1 stock split. What do you think about that?
So when companies do stock splits, remember there's a couple of reasons. One is the overvaluation, but more specifically, it also try to get what they call the lower tier investor. You can't invest in a stock that's going for $20,000 a share, but you might want to invest in a stock that's going for $50 a share. So those splits can benefit you and make you more attractive. So look at the nuances of why they split. Look at the rationale. The streaming services, especially post-COVID, have done phenomenal. So these are some of the areas that do really, really well. But like I always say, there are graveyards full of great companies that no longer exist. If there was, think about a company called Blockbuster, phenomenal video company, right? They had there was only one Blockbuster. Where are they today? So that concludes this week's episode for Watch Your Six. As I mentioned, please look us up on Spotify, Apple iTunes, YouTube channel. We enjoy all the information that we're sharing with you. We more importantly enjoy the feedback, and we want to be here to help you grow. And we thank you for everything you do. Have a great week. Talk to you soon.